All right, welcome everybody. I'm going to give this a second so that we can let everybody get into the webinar, and we'll begin momentarily. Let's see. All right, it looks like we're getting pretty close. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Lisa Bachman, and I'm the Executive Director at the Alabama Holocaust Education Center. We're so appreciative that you're joining us for the first episode of What History Teaches, The Rise of Nazism. This program is a result of a truly extraordinary collaboration among Holocaust education centers and museums from all across North America. It includes Alabama, Buffalo, Cincinnati, Illinois, Los Angeles, Montreal, and Seattle. And we all came together because we know that we're living in a moment that demands some clarity, courage, and most importantly, action. Antisemitism and so many other forms of hate are on the rise in our communities. We see them every day in the headlines and in our daily lives. And in the face of that reality, we know, based on the history of the Holocaust, that silence is not an option. This history has shown us what happens when good people look away. Together, we all hold a very deep responsibility to convey the lessons of the Holocaust in a way that resonates with the present and empowers you, all of you, everyone here today, to carry those lessons forward. This isn't just about history. This is about what we do with that history right now. As you watch this episode and all of the ones to follow, and please register for all of them, they're going to be amazing. We ask you to listen with an open heart. Allow yourself to reflect, to question. Please get curious. We hope that you find something in this series that not only informs you, but moves you, something that inspires you to recognize warning signs, to confront indifference, and to take a stand before hate has a chance to take hold. So let's begin. I'd like to introduce Haley Wells, who is our program manager, and she's going to kick off today's installment, Propaganda and Media Manipulation.
Hello, everyone. We have three wonderful panelists who will be speaking today, and so I would like to take a moment to introduce you to each of them. Our first panelist, Jonathan Wiesen, is a professor of history at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and he is also an author and editor of 4 books, including Creating the Nazi Marketplace, Commerce and Consumption in the Third Reich, and Nazi Germany, Society, Culture, and Politics. He recently edited the 2nd edition of the German History and Documents and Images primary source database on Nazi Germany, and he wrote the introduction to the Holocaust survivor and novelist H.G. Adler's nonfiction essays. And he is currently working on a monograph on Nazi Germany and the Jim Crow South. Our second panelist, Michele Forman, is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and professor of history and media studies at UAB. Her work with the UAB Media Studies program has created a student-produced archive of over 400 short documentary films about Alabama communities. The films are available free of charge online, streaming from both UAB Mervyn H. Stern Digital Collection and the UAB Media Studies Vimeo channel. Her own documentary work has been broadcast on HBO, Independent Film Channel, PBS, Sundance Channel, among others. Michele gained her early experience as an executive in feature films, serving as director of development at Spike Lee's 40 Acres and Emil Filmworks, where she was responsible for the acquisition and development of new projects. In addition, she served as associate producer on Mr. Lee's Academy Award-nominated film For Little Girls, a feature-length documentary for HBO about the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. She currently serves as the series producer for Southern Exposure, a documentary series about environmental issues that is in its 13th season. And our final panelist, John Archibald, is a journalist and a longtime voice in the South. He is a columnist at AL.com, a 2-time Pulitzer winner, and an award-winning podcaster. Archibald won the Pulitzer for commentary in 2018 for his lyrical and courageous columns and was lead reporter on the Pulitzer winner for local reporting in 2023, which examined out-of-control policing in the tiny Alabama town of Brookside. He was elected to last year to the Pulitzer Prize Board. In 2021, Archibald wrote and co-hosted the National Murrow Award-winning podcast Unjustifiable, the story of a Black woman killed by Birmingham police in 1979. He is the author of Shaking the Gates of Hell, A Search for Family and Truth in the Wake of the Civil Rights Revolution, one of NPR's favorite books of 2021. He was also a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University in 2020 through 2021 and the inaugural writer-in-residence at Boston University in 2023. And he is now working on a podcast series about the serial bomber Eric Rudolph and the rise of Christian nationalism. So please join me in welcoming each of these panelists, who will each take a bit of time to talk about propaganda and media manipulation in Nazi Germany and in the present. And we are going to start with Jonathan today. Can you tell us a little bit about the dynamics of Nazi propaganda? How did it work? What ideas and what worldview did it disseminate? And what was its effect?
Hi, Haley. Thank you so much. Thanks, Lisa. It's really good to be part of this. It allows me to think through ideas anew. I'm constantly revisiting this theme as we look at current manifestations of anti-Semitism and illiberalism around the world. And I will start just simply by saying that media is sort of the first thing my students think about when they think about Nazi Germany. Media manipulation, misinformation, how the public was won over to Nazi ideas. And it's striking how much we can do with this theme alone, because there are lies everywhere you look in Nazi Germany, and that many regimes that build their successes on mass manipulation depend on a kind of constant flow of lies. In the case of Nazi Germany, it was lies about Germany being peace-loving. It was about Hitler as a kind of gentle, soft-spoken soul who really just has the good of everybody in mind. But today I want to focus specifically on anti-Semitism. I want to do two things in my brief comments, along with showing some images. And that's first to kind of try to debunk an idea that my students come in to my classes about regarding brainwashing, that kind of tricky psychological term. And then secondly, I want to kind of question as well, or look at the effects, how Nazi Germany propaganda worked and the effects it had. And I'm going to make a case that, in fact, the big lie, that kind of concept we work with, is a little bit too simplistic. So allow me to share my screen here, and I'm just going to begin with a few images. Let me go back actually to the beginning. Sorry about that. All right. So this is a familiar image my students come to my classes with. This is a Nazi racist daily published by one of the great anti-Semites in history, a guy named Julius Streicher. Many of you know this who are tuning in here. It's the Stormer. It's a Nazi publication that really brings to the fore images of anti-Semitism. And I start with it because I'm getting at this notion that my students assume when they start my classes, and that's that everywhere you turn, it's the images of Jews as corruptors, rapists, capitalists, what have you. And there's a truth to this, but I'll question that a bit. So just looking at these images, you see something that is very powerful, very real, and very frightening. And that's images taken from the Middle Ages about Jews, whether it's Jews as kidnappers of young Christian children, the so-called ritual murder or blood libel idea. Whoops, let me go back to this. Or it's this idea that Jews forced you into the wars of. In the left, you see Jews blamed for World War I and thus the death of young Germans. In each case, it's about innocent Christians. In the case of on the right, it's the old canard that Jews drained the blood of young Christians for their rituals, including making matzah during Passover. And on the left, it's the idea that young Germans are martyrs to the Jewish capitalists who just wanted to make money through war. These images are real and they're present throughout Nazi Germany, but I want to make the case that there's a lot more going on too, and that you have to understand the power of propaganda by juxtaposing it with more conventional images you might see in any society. So again, you'll see something like this. These are the classic anti-Semitic tropes, the Eastern European Jew. In the case of the left, it says the scourge of God. Very typical images of the shtetl or small town Russian Jew, the long beards, the kaftans, the headgear. All of this is supposed to render Jews as the other. Or you'll see in children's books that you might get in a math class or a literature class in your second or third or fourth grade, images of conniving, scheming Jews, right here, for example, planning any number of crimes. So my point is that Nazi German propaganda depended on images like this, but many people were able to compartmentalize this. And this is really important. It's not that wherever you turned, you saw swastikas, images of corrupt and sort of disgusting Jews. It's that you saw this among a much more sort of normalized media environment, namely through ads, through any number of publications that don't talk about Jews. And this is really important, I think, to understanding the dynamics of racism, xenophobia, and eventually the Holocaust. Because what happens is many Germans take comfort in the reality that they're looking at happy images that we can see, for example, in any number of modern contexts. Nazi Germany presented itself as a modern consumer society, one recovering from the Great Depression. So after Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, you'll see much more of the media landscape and the advertising landscape looked a lot more like this. In magazines, you'll see kind of corrupt images of caricatures of Jews, but you'll also see ads for laundry detergent, keeping a clean house. You'll see ads for decaf coffee, supposedly healthier than caffeinated coffee. And of course, the classic Volkswagen, which leads you to mass mobilization, motorization, saving a little money for the VW bug. So why is this important? Well, I think, again, my students come in assuming that everything looks like this. And certainly, if you're young and in school, you'll encounter these images. But what happens, I would argue, is that in a fascist state like Nazi Germany that's really committed to racial purity, the government knows that you can't just oversaturate the public with racism. You have to give people who think of themselves as decent Germans, modern Germans, people who are busy with their lives and leisure, give them something to look forward to. So I find it really difficult, of course, to convince my students of this because I think we have an image of propaganda that's so much about the big lie. That is to say, you show images of Jews and you show them again and you show them again and you blame Jews for everything. All true, but it doesn't work as well. And the Nazis know this if you aren't offering something positive that can allow people to distance themselves. Now, the propaganda is contradictory. There's no question. Some of you have seen me lecture, know this image that I like to show how much people sort of rely on images that don't even make sense. Propaganda is not consistent. For example, this is an article about how brown skin, the farther south you go, makes you less Aryan and obviously then less valuable on the scale of humanity. On the other hand, it's juxtaposed with an ad for Nivea suntan lotion that literally exhorts you to brown yourself. And why is this important? To tan yourself. Why is this important? It reminds people that even if that they don't, a lot of people don't buy into the nonsense of propaganda. So again, the image of people who from 1933 up through the 1930s simply fall for these crude images of Jews and others is a little too simplistic. A lot of people, if you read their diaries, memoirs, they'll actually make fun of Der Stürmer in these crude caricatures of Jews on the left there, this Eastern European bearded Jew. And they'll say, we didn't buy into that stuff. We thought it was like, some people even compared it later on to the National Enquirer. That is to say, this was all considered ghoulish and kind of grotesque and lowbrow and not anything we paid attention to. Even the supposed charts that people would encounter both in classes or in public lectures, perhaps, that contrasted the so-called German youth, the pure Aryan German youth, with the kind of less than Jewish youth, would confuse people because not a few people would even say, these kids look perfectly nice too. So you're supposed to feel this kind of revulsion or at least recognition of another racial type here. And yet, as the Jews, the six images on the right are supposed to sort of give you some sense of how these are foreigners in your midst. But many people just rejected this. Why is that important? By rejecting the crudeness of some extreme anti-Semitism, people took, I would say, people took comfort in the fact that they embraced a much less severe version. They could fall back on traditional ideas about Jews as Christ killers and say, well, I'm not as crude as Der Stürmer, but I learned in church that Jews were Christ killers. Or you can fall back on an idea that, for example, Jews are capitalists. A lot of people would say, I don't buy that kind of racial nonsense. I don't buy the biological racism. I think this Der Stürmer is disgusting. But I do think Jews are kind of too involved in the economy, and thus we have to do something about it. I think this is a key way of looking at Nazi Germany, this sort of sense that you maintain your decency. In other words, there are people who look at the blockade of Jewish shops or Jewish courts when Jewish lawyers are no longer able to argue, or when Jewish-owned shops are boycotted, blockaded, and scrawled with graffiti. And they say to themselves, thank God I'm not that. Thank God I can see through the kind of nonsense of the crazies. But what this does is it frees, I think, people up to kind of either turn away or to say, that stuff's crazy, but other forms of Jewish control need to be taken care of. So it's a really interesting dynamic in my mind between the kind of crudeness of the big lies and the sense that most Germans have of themselves as decent, not naive enough to fall for these. So, for example, I'll end with this image. There's an image here of this terrible scrawling of Jewish shops, Jew, Judah, the classic sort of smearing of swastikas on Jewish-owned shops in the 1930s. And somebody takes the words here, this is a bedding store, and this is a store where you buy everything from children's prams, as I say in England, or wagons, day beds, what have you. And somebody writes, with garlic. So Jews with garlic. The average German, I would argue, would say, isn't that crude? Isn't that terrible? Let's stick with the rational anti-Semitism. Let's ignore that, but it's okay to limit Jews and how many are in this, how many are in schools. Let's limit the number of Jewish doctors. Let's limit the number of Jews who own companies. All of this is sort of a gradual effect that doesn't depend on embracing the big lies, the crude lies about Jewish blood libels, but instead depends on a sense, I think, of Germans as not vulnerable to these ideas, and thus that much more willing to tolerate lesser measures, which ultimately do, after a while, culminate in outright anti-Semitism, violence, and the Holocaust. So I'll sort of lay that in front of you and open to questions later. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan, for talking about the dynamics of Nazi propaganda. And I already see some questions coming in about other Jewish stereotypes, so I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about in the Q&A session. But for now, Michele, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how images and stories convey meaning or frame the world in a specific way, especially in propaganda, so we can start to break down more how propaganda actually works, on the average person.
For sure. Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to participate in this webinar and be here today. I feel like 3 cities that are really important to my family are represented here. Birmingham, of course, my home, but I was born in Cincinnati. And my mother, after the war, she and my grandparents and my uncle lived in Montreal. So really thrilled to be connected to these really important cities to us. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and maybe start off with a picture of my mother. She's that little girl on the pony on the left, and my grandparents at some beachside resort. These are images before the war. My mother was born in 1936 in Katowice, Poland. And you can imagine what her childhood may have been like. It's sort of extraordinary that she, my uncle, my grandparents survived. My grandfather, shortly after the breakout of the war in 1939, was taken prisoner by the Soviets. So he was in a Siberian labor camp for the duration of the war. But for the most part, My grandmother's strategy of survival was to pass. She was blonde, so she conformed to, you know, or defied stereotypes about Jewish identity and Jewish life. If you really bought into a lot of the most negative propaganda, she didn't necessarily fit. She was able to secure false papers. And my uncle was old enough to understand himself as a Jewish boy, and that left him in a terrible jeopardy. But for my mother, it's a very interesting case because at 3 years old, she just wasn't told she was Jewish. She had no sense of herself as Jewish. And she only found out about her Jewishness after the war. She, you know, was really shocked because one of the things that is so much a part of her story is that she internalized every single narrative about who those terrible Jews were. I mean, she begged my grandmother to go more often to church. And so one of the things that I think about with my mother, it took her a very, very long time to understand and love her Jewish identity. I think that in our family, there's a great deal of fear that still attends to all of us generationally about who knows we're Jewish. It feels a little bit like jeopardy that gets passed down to be identified as Jewish because of this generational experience. But one of the things that really struck me and that has endured through my life is the power of these kinds of foundational stories in shaping our understanding of the world. I was an English major in college. I was a huge reader as a kid. So I understand the ways in which stories are incredibly productive at being able to expand the world for you, to be able to allow you to understand more about the world. But I've also made it part of my work and study to understand the ways in which stories or narratives frame the world in ways that limit us, how we use them as a way to manage the complexity of the world when we're really frightened. And that sort of gets me into some of the basic mechanisms about the media that I want to talk about with you today. I've been very lucky in my academic life that I've gotten to do a lot of interdisciplinary work and interdisciplinary teaching. And early on, I was able to sort of get out of my film and media bubble, working with a fellow professor, faculty member who studies neuroscience, the brain, psychology. And he talks about basically brain efficiency, cognitive processing efficiency. And I want to talk with you a little about this kind of brain efficiency, the way we're hardwired, because I think it helps us understand how we as humans interact in a big information system like the media ecosystem that, we lived in the Nazi past, but certainly the one that is a fire hose of information in the present. So one of the sort of key ways to understand the brain, and again, sorry to all the real neuroscientists out there, I'm going to butcher your field with this, but basically, whenever we encounter a stimulus, it takes a huge amount of energy load. If we were to take it as a unique object and analyze it in all of its sensory details. So our brain has come up with ways to use shortcuts so that the thing in front of us seems like a lot like these other kinds of things that we've encountered before, and it recognizes it as a category, and we sort of move on. Is that a tiger or not a tiger? Can I get on with this walk through the woods? And as our brain develops from childhood, we sort of, are making meaning of the world we're exposed to. We're understanding the language system we're in, and that meaning making, that language winds up not just being a catalog or list of individual items, but actual, sort of think of them as like folders and big categories. So these cognitive mechanisms are by definition reductive. They are reducing the brain's workload so that, we can move through the world quickly, not use as much glucose. But you can definitely see how some of these problems are going to develop if that's our hardwiring, how those problems develop in an area like bias or stereotype formation. The frames get set, and it requires a good deal of work to uncategorize those basic categories. And that's really one of the things that I think is important for, I think of my work as a documentary filmmaker, as a teacher, those categorical shortcuts are not written in stone. You can complicate those frames, those foundations, through all sorts of exposures. I mean, there is a whole set of research around contact theory, the idea that meeting someone that's sort of different than your categorical definition than them is going to help complicate your stereotypes. I mean, sometimes you'll see exceptionalism. The Jews are like this, but my friend Michele is different in X, Y, and Z way. And then, of course, for me, very near and dear to my heart, education. I mean, I think that is exactly what we mean when we use that term critical thinking capacity as part of our goals as educators. It's working in some ways against our brain's hardwiring that wants quick and easy answers to move on to the next thing, to be able to sort of build an argument, to teach people how to build arguments that are based on evidence in logical, sequential ways. And so, and I do think, obviously, our brains work in a lot of different ways. Clearly, I think we as humans have a huge great joy and interest in doing hard things. I mean, we love puzzles and games, and those are all things that we're using to be able to push back against that sort of quick shortcutting. So there's definitely that in our hardwiring too. And I view that as like a really productive, landscape for us to work if our goal is to be able to work against bias. And particularly our media landscape, if we're going to work against bias, I think we need to understand a little about like basic representational dynamics, some of the relationships that emerge when you're making media. So, this is, my students are probably rolling their eyes. They see this representational triangle all the time. And I thought I'd sort of walk you through some of those sort of, axes of this. So, you have a media producer, whether that's, like a filmmaker, a journalist, a writer, a TikTok video maker. Somebody is making something with the intent to get some original content from a community. Some sort of participant is going to be represented. And, you think about the ways in which media producers may be critiqued for operating along this relational access. Are they honest with the participants about what their project is, about who they are or not? Are they collaborative? Do they talk to the participants about how they themselves see themselves or understand their place in the world? Are they extractive? Do they, drop in and with a parachute, gravitate to the most sort of sensational action, have no understanding of context, and pull it out without any kind of, effort at understanding bigger systems? And then I think the other thing that we have to think about is the medium. I mean, probably deep down, I'm a Marshall McLuhan Knight. Marshall McLuhan famously used that term, the medium is the message, meaning that the format in which we make and receive messages may be as important as the actual content of that message. And so really thinking about how is it that media producers operate? Are they working in language and text? Is it audio that they're extracting? Is it visual? Because all of those operate in different ways in relationship, not only to the community represented, but on this other axis, how they're delivering that message to the media consumer, to the audience, to the viewer. So one of the ways in which I think about this, and particularly in visual communication, is the media consumer able to understand who authored the message they receive? I mean, a good portion of people of my generation, we have very clear authorship and authorship standards. When you read a book, it has an author's name on it. If it is an academic or scholarly text, it's going to have a footnotes, bibliography. It's going to have source information that create that evidentiary sequence for someone to be able to understand whether what they're receiving as the message is credible or not. I think part of the way in which we start getting into murky territory is in images. If I look at a painting, I understand that there was a human hand that had to paint that. If I read something in the newspaper, I'm going to see John Archibald's byline. And if I read an op-ed or an opinion piece, I understand that this may not be John operating as an objective journalist, but speaking to me in his voice, but I understand that he has authored it, and I understand his position in delivering that message. Photographs have a sort of unique status. They're called in the sort of world of semiotics an indexical sign. Indexical signs are like footprints at the beach at the sand, a fingerprint that you leave on your screen. It's a trace of the real. We understand that for an indexical sign to be made, it wasn't authored in the same way that it's made up, written down, painted on a canvas. It is some sort of mechanical process where the thing that's being represented, the participant, the community, the object, had to share space and time in front of a lens and some sort of photosensitive material to be able to actually generate that object, that message for us. That photograph carries with it a certain amount of authenticity that we don't necessarily automatically ascribe to other authored works. And that's become super tricky. We trust photos in a way that we probably shouldn't. Photos point at things at the world, but very, very talented photographers and filmmakers are certainly commenting on them. They are, instituting as much authorship over what that photograph gives us as any writer or painter. And that's something that is hard for us to cognitively trust because, seeing is believing. That authorship is less visible. And so, to me, even though I'm in the business of making films, fundamentally, I view that as a real risk. I mean, we're in it. I mean, we're past the world of risk. We're living in it. That when you move away from textual communication and to visual communication, you really have a lot more possibility of being able to trigger those cognitive shortcuts rather than the kind of critical thinking. And so you have to do a lot more work to do that kind of visual decoding. I think that, one of the other things that I want to talk about is it's not just the media producer at the pinnacle of the triangle that you're dealing with, because there are relationships that pre-exist any message. And that's really where anti-Semitism comes in. Media consumers, audiences, viewers already carry with them a lot of foundational narratives. They carry with them a lot of frameworks. And so those cultural narratives, I mean, you almost can invert, instead of seeing as believing as seeing. They are going to take from what is presented and fit it into a framework, even if it is not exactly a fit. And the more emotional you might be, the more primed you are to be able to scapegoat, and in an ecosystem, a media ecosystem like the one we live in now, where we're very polarized, we are very often invested in defending ourselves or feeling like we must defend ourselves as the good guys against somebody who's accusing us of being wrong or bad. It puts us in, a state of mind where we are more likely to accept lies that bolster our beliefs than any kind of complicated evidence. It sort of gives us a sort of emotional reward. So I'm sure in questions we'll have discussion about more contemporary time, but I wanted to just, maybe end with, just a couple of insights about probably the most well-known propagandistic film from the Nazi era. This is Triumph of the Will, filmed by Leni Riefenstahl. There's Leni Riefenstahl standing with Adolf Hitler. They are preparing for the Nazi Party rally rally in Nuremberg in 1934 that she's about to film. She had filmed with him prior to Triumph of the Will the year before in 1933. It's a film that is much less known and much less aesthetically compelling. It's called Victory of the Faith. And she learned her lessons by filming this Nazi party rally. So think about, campaign rallies or like the big annual political conventions in presidential years. That's essentially what the event was that she was set to film. But she learned her lesson from 33, that to make compelling visuals, she needed a set. So she worked with Hitler's favorite architect, Albert Speer, to design specifically the convention background for the camera. She came in with 16 cameramen and a 120-person production team. So that's 30 cameras that they were operating with sound trucks. She invented all sorts of shots. They dug out troughs in front of the podium to get better, more dramatic camera angles. She shot 61 hours of footage for a 2-hour film. And so, she used pre-existing sort of, aesthetic lessons from, cinema, from the greats, Hollywood and European classics, to sort of boost the production value of this movie. So I'm sure you've seen some of these images in the past. One of the, key observations that, one of my favorite cultural critics, Susan Sontag, wrote a great essay called Fascinating Fascism, in which she looks at Leni Riefenstahl's body of work. And she comes up with certain kinds of aesthetic features of Triumph of the Will, as well as other examples from Riefenstahl's oeuvre that, are really emphasizing a certain kind of bigness, that there's no room for difference, there's no room for dissent, there's no room for imperfection, there's only room for one individual. The rest of the individuals are subsumed into the mass. And so you can see the shot of Hitler from below, again, aggrandizing him, creating, an image of a sort of godlike national figure or leader. She was very attuned to the kind of pre-existing cultural symbolism. So again, if you think about, again, these sort of pre-existing narratives and icons from a culture, these are sort of very famous images that date back to the heyday of sort of German Empire, German power of the 19th century, the sort of landscape paintings of the German sublime, Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea, of Fog. Leni Riefenstahl had a career as an actress in mountain movies, a very popular genre. Hitler discovered her in a movie she made called The Blue Light in 1932, in which much of the iconography echoed that of Germany's great historic past. Again, it's a yearning for something positive to feel good about. Again, nothing in this is a sort of terrifying image to us, but if you watch Triumph of the Will, you are not going to see the kinds of images that Jonathan started off. Just to echo Jonathan's point, there's nothing in here. You're not going to hear about final solutions. It's too early for that. You're not going to hear about even, the Jewish question. You are going to hear about what it means to be a good German, what it means to be strong again, and you are going to see iconography that harkens back to a sort of mythic German past that people are longing for. Again, if you don't know how to decode it, it's tough to see. Leni Riefenstahl very cleverly constructed a 4.5-minute opening to Triumph of the Will, in which Hitler arrives by plane coming in through the clouds over the medieval city of Nuremberg, and it focuses on, the castle, the great buildings and sites of Nuremberg. The shadow of the plane looks like a cross moving across the city. These uses of symbols are very important sort of framing or priming tools for the rest of the political discourse that you're going to see, but it requires a certain amount of knowledge and decoding to be able to read these kinds of images. I'll leave with this. there are images. Maybe I'll just play this. It's just, some of her aesthetic. So that's just sort of an example of that sort of bigness, losing the individual to the mass, the excitement of becoming part of the crowd, becoming one with the state. What's interesting is that many of these same images were used by Frank Capra in his American propaganda series, Why We Fight, Prelude to War, that the symbolic context really matters, that this clip, an argument about German strength within the media context of Germany subjugated between the wars, suffering during the Great Depression, an urge for German greatness. That same image of German strength is used in American propaganda. This is commissioned by the Office of War Information, screened to troops in 1942 to make the argument as why America has to fight this war against, this kind of mass fascist military. All right, I'll leave it there and look forward to questions.
Thank you, Michelle. I know we have a ton to unpack with that. That was very incredible. And so finally, John, I know we've talked quite a bit about propaganda, and obviously the other side of that is legitimate journalism and legitimate media that, we hope is telling the truth in some way. So I wonder if you could speak briefly about how authoritarian political systems tend to erode legitimate journalism over time, and how can the average person tell when legitimate journalism is being eroded and the sort of bar for truth is getting pushed further and further. And then after this, we will have time for questions.
Right. Well, Michelle and Jonathan, you guys were great. I'm afraid I'm going to bring the grade level down a little bit here, but really fascinating stuff. Legitimate journalism is being eroded. Just know that going in, it's eroded, fragmented. It's the Tower of Babel out there, and I think everybody knows it. I'm just not sure, to what extent. Attacks on the legitimate press. And when I talk about the legitimate press, I mean news agencies that correct their mistakes, that seek to give voice to all people, that, excuse me, abide by traditional journalism, ethics, and values. Those attacks have been around forever, but lately they've been incredibly successful. Thomas Jefferson had quite a few beefs with newspapers back in his day, but he also said, he preferred news without government than government without news. But now it's like an imperfect, perfect storm. The president, excuse me, calls the press for the enemies of the people. Even my wife gets news from randos on YouTube who may or may not be ethical or may not be doing their own reporting. Cable news, gives their watchers information that confirms what they already think, that seems more entertainment or propaganda than it does news to me sometimes. But I honestly think that the biggest threat to truth right now are the tech billionaires and the rush to put faulty artificial intelligence in the hands of anybody. Big social media used to offer a distribution platform for news, which made news companies reliant on them and the ad revenue that it provided. And then Facebook and X snatched that away, either for profit or evil intent or just under political pressure. So now they use algorithms to suppress links to news and commentary from what I would consider the legitimate press. All this while encouraging the sharing of AI generated memes and stories. You've seen them on Facebook if you're on Facebook, about politicians or celebrities who do terrible things or heart-wrenching things or all that, posted generally under a false name with administrators based in another country that are completely devoid of attribution, byline, someone to call, or any kind of evidence of indicator of truth. And I mean, you think about that. You got people across the world writing stories that are completely false, but are accepted so much that they are shared by the thousands on a medium that suppresses legitimate news. So hence the Tower of Babel in a geyser of information, even intelligent people. I mean, I can't tell you the number of people, very, very intelligent, smart, alert people who share these things because they think they are, um, because they want to think they are real. And it's difficult even for me when I look at them to get sucked in. But it's hard to separate truth from garbage. The bottom line is Meta, Facebook's owner, in addition to firing all its fact checkers under political pressure, has a very clear financial interest in keeping people on its site and keeping people from clicking on links that will take them to news sites elsewhere. So essentially, the distribution platform that used to allow us to share our stories has been taken away. And so there's a lot of good stories out there that just never get seen by a lot of people. And it's my belief that suppressing real news, suppressing truth, is a form of propaganda in and of itself. And resisting it is important and hard, and supporting real people and their real work is critical for humanity and the Republic and our understanding of reality. So, so I would encourage you to get your news from an entity that corrects its mistakes, that sometimes does make you mad at the messenger, that has somewhere you can call or email to complain about how you didn't like something or you did like something or whatever. And in a world that thinks, because of these social media platforms and their origins, that news is free, you might have to pay for it if they give you something you think to be of value. And I mentioned at first, I've been working on this podcast about serial bomber Eric Rudolph. And he's the guy who bombed the Olympics and three other places, including a clinic in Birmingham in the 90s. He's a Holocaust denier and at times referred to himself as Adolf Rudolph. And he was, in looking at that, we're trying to figure out, how he was radicalized. And he was radicalized, by neighbors and that, but also by underground newsletters that were sent to his house and plain brown envelopes, and by tapes he ordered from anti-Semitic preachers, and by visits to Aryan nations encampments on the other side of the country. And it's just so striking to realize that now all of that effort, and this is 25 years ago, 27 years ago, all that effort that it took him, to fall into this hate, is now available in an instant on Google. And don't even get me started about the dark web. And it's easy and it's insidious. And so if you look at that 27 years, it is so insidious. It has become so much more acceptable. In the 1990s, that bomber and his white nationalist, Christian nationalist rhetoric was widely condemned across the aisle. I mean, the search for this guy at that time, before 9/11, was the largest manhunt in American history. And now, if you turn on whatever randos you might get your news from, you hear those same words or something very like them repeated over and over again in courthouses, in state houses, and even in the White House. And it's poison. And I'll end it right there.
Well, thank you, everyone. We do have some time for questions, and I see more questions coming in, thanks to all the wonderful and insightful points y'all brought up. So let's see. Some of these are quite long, so it's going to take me just a second to read them, and find one to start with. Let us start with one going back to Der Stürmer, and this is directed at Jonathan, but I think all of y'all might have something to say about this. This person asked, do you think the Nazis anticipated that Stryker's crude approach might help legitimize the more rational anti-Semitic stereotypes, or was that simply a byproduct that worked to their purposes? But I think this is applicable to the film that Michele talked about as well, and to these larger questions of, legitimate journalism. Is there a sort of coherent push to, disseminate very irrational propaganda, because there's also much more rational propaganda that people will buy into?
Maybe I'll start with that since it's directed to the Nazi theme particularly, but I think it's a great question because the way I presented it, I kind of talked about a byproduct of this kind of interplay between regular media, something like not too dissimilar from what Michele was pointing about, the kind of traditional forms of movie making that allowed people to kind of present a normalcy to the Third Reich. But and the question is though one of intentionality. I do think that propaganda minister Goebbels, I do know this, and some of his employees were very conscious of the fact that the public could only take so much. So it's very important, and this will be curious. I'll be curious to see if others agree about this, but certainly there was a sense of pushback at times. We have this sense that the Nazi public, the German public, couldn't say anything in dialogue with their government. But in fact, you would have public opinion polls, you would have marketing research that talked about people repulsion toward too much propaganda. And they would, again, in this sort of sense of self-congratulation, they would see themselves as able to distinguish between BS and fact. And that's something that's, of course, lost, as John talked about in many ways. But it doesn't mean they were successful, but it meant that the regime had to pay attention when they felt they were being too preachy. So to your question, David, I do think there's a semi-conscious and at times very conscious effort to limit the kind of oversaturation of anti-Semitism to certain key moments, whether it's through a film like, where you might not necessarily have the crudest anti-Semitic stereotypes, but just simply focus, for example, on The Merchant of Venice, something like that is familiar to people. But it's a great question about media dynamics and intentionality.
Do either of our other panelists have something they want to add? I'm sorry, y'all. I'm still clicking through with these, and they're quite long.
I answered a couple online too, so which we don't normally do, but
and that was very helpful. Oh, this question that just came in is very good, and I think this is something that you all might have some information on, John and Michele especially. What advice can one give as to best refute or deal with today's tsunami of misinformation?
Oops.
John, you're muted.
Well, it is very hard. I mean, because it requires work on your part. It requires work in deciding who is trustworthy, and that means, developing some real news literacy. And if you have people that, again, it goes back to those things I talk about, correcting errors and whatnot, but also resisting the urge to share things that feed into your own personal biases that are not verifiable. And in this age, whether, it's Michele, tells us you can't even believe what you see at times. So, and I think the responsibility is on us to get to listen to those people who demonstrate that they make real effort to to tell the truth and to get their facts, and we'll correct it when they're done. But it's on us ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, I wish it weren't so fully on each of us as an individual. I'd really like to see, usually it is, sadly, 20 years after a new media technology is introduced into the culture, that any kind of regulation catches up with it. So that's a really significant lag time, particularly in a really accelerated. That's sort of been the, late 19th through the mass media forms through the 20th century. But that's a really long time in social media world, and especially with the increasing capacities of generative AI, which are just going to compound the problem. So, for individuals, I think there are some great resources out there. I think there's some really great ones, particularly for educating young people on how to deal with meme culture, online culture, video game boards. I mean, these are all spaces in which, I mean, John, I love your example of Rudolph having to pursue this kind of information. In this case, many of our young people aren't even choosing it for themselves. They're being bombarded with it. And so, being able, before you sort of share it on your feed, really thinking about slow down and figure out, this is a message that is coming to me because somebody wants me to think something, feel something, or do something. So who is that someone? Analyze, what is it that this was created to get me to do? And I think that's powerful with young people because they don't like to be manipulated. So let them know they're being manipulated. And then, why was this created? What is this image trying to get me to dislike, and why? So really thinking about, the language and imagery that otherizes or creates lulls. Why am I laughing at the expense of somebody? I think this is, very important with the increasing dissemination of contemporary antisemitism, but I think it's across the board in a lot of the ways we otherize vulnerable communities.
Oh yeah, John, you were next.
Well, you answered some of what I was going to say, but I'm really curious about the 20-year thing. So are we saying, so if that's true, then at the in the, social media should be regulated in 2 or 3 years, right?
Yeah, I know.
But then,
If only our political systems really work. But, I mean, I'm very concerned about legislation that's being sent around to state houses now, which are going to put a moratorium on AI regulation for 10 years. We're already seeing the ways in which distortions in our political system are preventing sort of regulation. We really have self-regulating tech. There were periods of time where it looked like there was going to be some sort of clamping down on disinformation or filtering of platforms, but largely that has been lifted recently. So we're in a, I mean, I would love that 20-year rule were rock solid, but that tends to be the trend historically. Does not mean for the present and future.
Can I also add, just in terms of advice, that I think all of us need to sort of pause and look at our own biases and question how vulnerable we think we are. Because again, I think when people heard, for example, Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about Jewish space lasers, or they hear Pizzagate, which taps into this whole kind of tradition that can relate to Jewish conspiracy, in fact, you tend to sort of say, well, I don't fall for this stuff. But what then I do think happens is people kind of, as I pointed out in the 30s, they do kind of open themselves in very unconscious ways sometimes to lesser kind of stereotypes that can be equally damaging than the more extreme ones. Now, of course, it's hard in this landscape, as Michele and John pointed out, to kind of self-question and label yourself as a kind of vulnerable to manipulation. But I think we all need to kind of pause and do that in our lives in ways that people sometimes thought they were doing successfully in the 30s, but many simply were not.
and this may not be exactly relevant to that question, but it is to me. And we have got to figure out how to disagree with each other without despising the person for their opinions. And for the majority of my career, I mean, I learned more from people who disagreed with me than I did from those who agreed with me. And there's nothing that I like more than somebody to tell me I disagree with you on everything you ever write, but I read you anyway. So I mean, and I think that the only way we can get past a lot of this stuff is to just find that common ground.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think this is a great place to end. I hate to cut y'all off, but we are at time. I know we could all talk for a while longer, and there are a ton of questions. So maybe we can answer some of them and send out like a follow-up email addressing all of them and also sharing some resources that will address continuing media literacy and, how to protect yourself from fake news online. So very quickly, the next installment of What History Teaches will take place on Wednesday, August 13th at noon Eastern Time. So that's 11 Central Time if you're in Alabama. And this session will be hosted by the Holocaust Education Resource Organization of the Buffalo Jewish Federation, and it will feature Dr. Larry Jones and Dr. Dean Pavlakis, and it will talk about the erosion of democracy during Hitler's rise to power. So all sorts of interesting stuff about the collapse of the Weimar Republic, the rise of authoritarianism. I think it's going to be a really great session. You can register for that and all of the other What History Teaches sessions on our webpage. That is ahhecinfo.org. They're all there. It's a very simple registration. So please do go register, tell your friends, come to the next one. For this session, you will receive an email with a link to the recording so that you can watch it again and get more out of all the great information that has been shared, and also share it with your friends, family, show it to anyone who might be interested. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you, John, Michelle, and Jonathan. This has been wonderful. We've had a great time, and we can't wait to see you all at our next program. And have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.